Welcome back to the Kickstarter studio, where we have got one heck of a guest for you. None other than, and I'm sorry because you're right here, the legendary Amy Hennig.
Not good at all.
Director, writer, and now independent contractor as well, doing some consulting work, which I mean, I can't imagine how excited people are to bring in you to tell them things about narrative design.
Well, I mean, I'm just trying to dabble in areas that fascinate me. Thankfully, I sort of put away some money for a rainy day, so I don't have to freak out too much while I sort of take a year to scope the landscape. But it's been fun to take some gigs in like VR, and like I did a volumetric video capture shoot at the Intel stage. Been in some writers' rooms, things that are just sort of like just to kind of keep my hand in, and also let me test out some new technologies, things like that.
So speaking of VR, what do you make of it? Because it's one of those mediums that I'm really excited about, but lots of people are, you know, oh, it's dead, it's not going anywhere, and yet it seems to have this incredible potential for the most immersive storytelling that we'll ever see.
Yeah, no, look, I mean, VR's not dead, and it won't be a gimmick that just goes away, right? The challenge, of course, is that as a piece of consumer hardware, we're just not there yet. And obviously, you know, people are pushing on that. You've got the Oculus Quest coming out pretty soon. And so, you know, inevitably we will get to a place where that hardware is, you know, palatable and attractive in terms of price and then set up and everything for a mainstream audience, but also we'll have the content that will draw an audience. I think the challenge of there are multiple challenges of VR, right? One of them is it tends to be somewhat isolating of an experience, which is why I think we might see more of a more sort of location-based VR experiences. One of the companies I was consulting with last year was The Void for 6 months. Because that's a shared experience, even though you've all got the headsets on, you're in there together. And I think that's what maybe a mainstream audience misses somewhat, is it's somewhat isolating to pop the headset on all by yourself. So AR may actually be more of a thing first, I think. But I think just AR, MR, VR, they're all going to be a thing, right? You know, it's just the hardware has to come down, the business model has to make sense. You know, we have to crack some things in terms of design, but we'll get there.
So taking it back to storytelling, let's talk about your career, because there are not many that parallel it when it comes to narrative design and direction.
Oh, thank you, that's kind.
But true, absolutely true. And you know, you are this kind of legendary icon. So I'm so interested to hear about how attitudes towards the importance of storytelling in games have changed from when you began to where you are now.
Well, it's interesting. Like, I feel like we never took story for granted exactly in the past. Like, you didn't have to fight for it exactly. It's sort of like if it was inherent in your game design and it made sense, then yeah, you put a story in there. I think that obviously I was fortunate to be in a couple of positions where we were able to really push the envelope and maybe kind of really, you know, set the bar for the industry. You know, sometimes it's just, you know, grace of God, your right place, right time, right team, right? I think the challenge now is, even though we still talk about how important story is, I think we've made it more difficult than it used to be. It was not unusual in the past to have very finite story games where, you know, you could finish them within 6, 8, 10 hours and, you know, have a wonderful experience and put it on your shelf like a favorite book or a favorite DVD. And now it feels like, you know, the entire industry, except for kind of the indie space, are pushing for the blockbusters and figuring out how do we, as an industry, engage the players for a long or infinite amount of time, right, where we have games as service. And even in the midst of that conversation, nobody says, well, so story is dead, right? Yeah. But then we have to get into sort of a semantic argument about what do we mean by story, right? And obviously, as a story person, what I mean by it is an authored experience. And I don't mean like, you know, I am the auteur and my word goes. I mean that we, as a team, craft an intentional authored experience for the audience. And that means certain things. It means certain structural things and story landmarks and planning setups and payoffs and twists and turns, and then landing the story in this sort of as perfect as we can with this kind of surprising but inevitable ending. And none of that's possible if the game never ends, right? Now, granted, we can do this in sort of bite-sized pieces, so I guess a better analogy might be a TV series where we don't know how many seasons we'll have, but you still try to make sure the discrete episodes themselves or the discrete chapters still have a shape and an intention that's going somewhere, right? And I feel like we're in such a state of change where, you know, like I said, we look back at 2007, Uncharted 1 versus even Uncharted 4, and the scale and scope of the game. You know, we're hearing more and more, this is just in general, that, you know, people are not finishing these games. And that was always the thing. There was always sort of a weird piece of common wisdom in the game industry that it's like, yeah, 10% of people will finish your game, which is such a weird concept, right?
Yeah.
And that's just become more and more true as these games have gotten so big. And so we have to rethink what we mean by story. There's a lot of talk around using machine learning to help to tell stories or to completely procedurally tell stories, which of course weirds me out a little bit. Because one would think it's a communication between two human beings, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a whole other topic. But I mean, story is an interesting time. So I mean, we talk about story a lot, but we all mean something different by it. We talk about players telling their own stories, and I'm not against that.
Yeah.
But sometimes I semantically argue about, well, what does that mean? If it's a series of events that you are then sort of interpreting and sort of, it's almost like a Rorschach test, right? Where you go, yeah, well, you create a shape and you create a story in your head, but doesn't story imply author, right?
Yeah.
Even when we have collaborative stories like Dungeons and Dragons, there's a dungeon master, right?
Yeah.
There's still somebody who's helping craft the thing. And so I just want to make sure we don't lose the fact that intention and authorship is important. Which is why I'm excited about potential other ways to tell stories, interactive stories.
So what are you looking at? Because obviously I know that you are kind of exploring new ways to tell stories. I heard that you were very interested in kind of the Netflix interactive series that we've seen recently and the way that they are able to just reach more people who don't consider themselves gamers, who aren't necessarily coming looking for what they understand to be a game.
Right. I mean, so what I've been talking about a lot, and again, this is all speculation because we don't know what happens next. But it's kind of like, I'm just trying to compartmentalize and go, okay, well, if we believe that 5G is inevitably going to be a thing, widespread 2 to 5 years, it changes the whole playing field, not just for games, for the entertainment industry, right? For all industries. And then if we go, all right, so that means that we'll actually be able to reach a mainstream audience that don't consider themselves gamers and aren't buying gaming hardware with real-time streamed content. That's a game changer, right?
Yeah.
So to speak. And that's why you see a lot of people in traditional media space, linear space, TV, film, looking at how they get into the interactive space because they see these lines getting really blurry in the next few years.
Yeah.
More so than I think we do. And I think they're right. Now, what remains to be seen is how much of an appetite is there amongst the mainstream audience for interactive content that isn't like really, really casual. And the reason I appreciate the fact that Bandersnatch exists and that Netflix funded it is because it's a great little nugget of an example to see how frictionless that was, unless you had Apple TV, unfortunately, but how frictionless that was for the audience to go, I already subscribe, it doesn't cost me a thing. I already know I like Black Mirror. This thing pops up in my on my screen. I can click on it, and then like boom, I'm playing it. So the problem in terms of trying to reach or ease a non-gamer audience into interactive content is any little obstacle is probably going to have them go, it's not for me. Never mind, right?
Yeah.
And that's cost, controller, like everything, right? And content potentially. So I think it behooves us, those of us that know how to make real-time content and know how to kind of find this perfect intersection between story, real-time content, and interactivity, to be the ones setting the tone and setting the bar for this new market, this new audience, right? If you think about it, these numbers are probably wrong, and I could be pulling them out of my butt. But let's say we're pointing right now at 200 to 300 million like core gamers, right? Well, the estimates of how big that audience really is when you think about casual gamers and the TV watching audience is 2 to 4 billion, right? Like it's massive.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you're literally going to like convert all those people, and I don't think we should even think of it that way. We have to have new language around all this.
Yeah.
But it's crazy just from a completely mercenary point of view that we wouldn't be trying to like figure out how we set the tone for that market. or leave that money on the table. And also, it's just really not cool that we're leaving that potential audience unserved because we're putting up walls around our hobby, if we're putting up walls around our hobby, right? Culturally, or in terms of kind of our identity as gamers, right? And so this is just going to take a lot of kind of creative soul searching, I think. It's going to take a lot of interaction with people that are already in the traditional media space and game companies. Like, we're just going to see so much change in the next 5 years, you know, which is exciting and scary too, right?
Well, speaking of change, you know, I have to touch on Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order.
Yeah.
We've learnt more about now.
Right.
They've come out very clearly, you know, EA, and said this is going to be a single-player game that they're going all in on, selling it like that, saying no multiplayer, it's all about the story, which obviously, when we saw your project close down, was the opposite of what they said. Yeah. And so how have you felt seeing this come out?
It's a little surreal,
yeah.
if I'm honest. Now, Respawn, very fortunately, and I'm not even saying this in any way that's meant to sort of, you know, insult or denigrate anybody, but they're in a fortunate position of being, they were recently acquired, and Vince has been very great about keeping the identity of that team secure and not just sort of getting absorbed into the larger corporation, and that means that I think he's in a position of power to sort of protect the vision of the team. Yeah. I mean, he's on the executive staff, you know, so it's like they have protections that we didn't have. Yeah. I mean, look, I only wish them well. Those guys are my friends. Yeah. I've heard very cool things. I haven't seen the game, but I've heard very good things about it. I'm looking forward, like everyone, to see what they show at Celebration today. But yeah, man, it just shows you how the winds of change keep swinging back and forth, right? Yeah. Like, you know, that's what I'm saying. It's not even like a criticism of anybody or any organization. When we're seeing all these newsworthy events and all this confusion, all this contradiction, what that is the canary in the mine that we are undergoing massive amounts of change, and I think nobody quite knows where we should be next, right? Yeah. And depending on who you talk to in the entertainment industry or in the game industry, there are opinions all over the map about where we should be positioning ourselves, what streaming means, whether we should be pursuing streaming, what that future looks like, and about the kind of content that we're making. I mean, obviously, it's been very clear that most big publishers have been chasing the games as service model because when the price point of these games doesn't move beyond $60, and it shouldn't, right? Because I think that there's a line there that we really shouldn't cross, but we also have to acknowledge that games have always cost that. Yeah. Actually, more than that, because I'm even just not accounting for inflation, right? Yeah. So, but we were able to sort of absorb some of the costs of increased development because the cost of goods kept going down. Cartridges to discs, discs to digital distribution, right? But now there's nowhere to go. And so we have these very big teams, very big productions. The cost of development is, I mean, many times more than it used to be. The team size is many times more. The size of the games at least double. And so that's where we've now set the bar. I don't know how we change from that if we decide that we want a wider palette of games. And so one thing that's been interesting to me is I have some time to step back and kind of peruse the landscape and talk to people and connect dots is that, you know, a blue ocean in terms of, you know, the creative palette of what we can do may be in this new space. Because in the same way that I think, you know, well, obviously cable TV too, but a lot of these streaming services really did usher in a golden age of television we talk about. Yeah. Because they have to fill their program, right? They need a portfolio of content that's all kinds of stuff for all kinds of people, and all kinds of levels of commitment in terms of time. And I think it's actually exciting that that could happen to games, right? Yeah. That if people have a streaming subscription service, they need more than one type of game. We've really narrowed our genres a lot in games in the last few years, and I think this will open it up. And I think it'll open it up to indies who are already kind of creating the content that I think would reach this audience, but right now there's no discoverability, right? Yeah. So do you think this makes it more difficult to be a narrative designer, to be a writer, when
we're not entirely sure what audiences want or what we even want to give them? Does it mean you have to have a kind of a wider portfolio, a wider skill set than perhaps you had to have when games were a little more straightforward?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're what I would think of as a narrative designer or a writer on a game team, which is embedded, so you really are a designer, not kind of an externally sourced writer. Yeah, I mean, I think we've all been trying to sort of be flexible and sort of, sway with the tide here. But, yeah, I mean, a lot of what we know how to do is about classically structured narrative, which we then try to adapt to games and interactive. And then we talk about, a story that just sort of goes on and never potentially ends and doesn't have sort of clear chaptering or anything like that. There's not a lot of great models for that. And the risk is getting into the bad version of story, and this is, coming from Trey Parker and Matt Stone, that, the bad version of story is when you just sort of say, and then, and then, and then. It's just a series of events, right?
Yeah.
Stories really shouldn't have and-thens in them, right? They really need buts and therefores. They're twists and turns, right?
Yeah.
And I suppose through some sort of machine learning or procedural system, you could kind of program in, procedural buts and therefores. But usually that's because, there's a craft to it. There's people behind it, right? And so my concern is unless we think about how we're going to deliver story content in a way that still feels discreet for this audience, so they feel like they're not just buying into this endless experience, if story's important to them, then we have to think about how we're parceling it out and structuring it, which is why I think it's not bad for us to look at a Netflix model. Now, look, I'm also biased because my career has been more about deconstructing traditional narratives from cinema and then reconstructing them as games, right? Not all games are that or should be that, right?
Yeah.
But when I look at it, I look at Netflix and go, okay, well, people have very limited amount of time. They're very distracted these days, right? We have so many things pulling at our attention. So one of the things I was saying today is that, like, you wouldn't sit down and go, okay, the Stranger Things, everybody says it's great, but it's going to take 10 hours. I think it's not quite that. It's, maybe it's 9 or something like that. But you would go, oh, God, when are we going to sit down and watch that?
Yeah.
Right? And that's how these games feel, right? That it's like you fire up some of these big games and you're just kind of like, it's almost like an appointment with the game, right?
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely, yeah.
It's sort of this, and there's so many layers to it, there's all the skill trees and there's all the submissions and the maps, and you start off already kind of like exhausted, right? Kind of like, this is a job, Like you have to plan to play these games. It's not like you can sort of drop in and drop out in some games, in some cases. Whereas I think the relationship we're seeing with television or just our devices and our screens is there's a lot more of this discrete content that people are consuming to the degree that the traditional, TV industry is actually looking at how they create even smaller content, 10-minute episodes, because people's time is so fragmented and their attention is so fragmented. But you look at Netflix, and so what they'll do is it's like, no, it's just an episode, You stop at 1 if you want, right? You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to make a commitment. It's right there. Just click on it. Maybe you like it. Maybe you don't. So that gives us a nice variety of content, right? And then we find that, we spend the entire weekend binging a thing because we fall in love with it. We didn't start off going like, I'm going to play for 10 hours or I'm going to watch for 10 hours, right? And that's kind of what we tried to do with Uncharted as well. Yeah. That, like, we put the chapters in so that it felt like there were natural breaks, but we also put little cliffhangers in so that you, were, dying to see what happened next. Yeah. It's just TV structure, right? Yeah. So we could make games that way. We practically already are if you look at games like Uncharted, right? Yeah. So it's fascinating to me to think that we could actually, really expand what we mean by interactive narrative. And not because I think they're pejorative, but I'm almost careful about using the words game and play and beat because so much of the language around games is partly what I think makes a mainstream audience go, I'm not sure that's for me. Yeah. If it's about difficulty and mastery and competition and a complex controller, all these things that we sort of, take pride in as gamers because it's kind of, that's our hobby, right? Yeah. I think it's a shame that if we go, well, if you can't hang, this isn't for you, right? And if that means that we need to expand what we mean by interactive entertainment so that we're, maybe we don't call them games in this case because they're experiences, and they're experiences without punitive qualities or fail states. It's more about going on a journey. And we see this already in the indie space. We see it with games like Detroit and, you know, Edith Finch and all these. I mean, you have choices, but you don't have fail states.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Uncharted there, and obviously,
Yeah.
how could I talk to you and not talk about Uncharted? But one of the things I did want to ask about is I've always heard that you were really keen when you were at Crystal Dynamics to get your hands on Tomb Raider. And obviously, I'm interested to know if you had, would we have seen an Uncharted-style Tomb Raider, or was Uncharted always, you know, going to be that, and it was a kind of standalone idea?
The wishy-washy answer is yes and no, right? And I'll explain if I can. So when I was at Crystal for 8 years, working on Legacy of Kain and Soul Reaver, it became clear. It's like in spring of 2003. Naughty Dog contacted me and said, "Would you come work for us?" And I'm like, "I am in the middle of this project." And that was the last Legacy of Kain game I worked on. And then they had me come down and talk and stuff like that. And I was pretty intrigued. I was just about to hit my 40s, I think, and so I was a little bit like, yeah, I could use a big shakeup at this point.
Yeah.
And it didn't seem like we were going to make any more Legacy of Kain games. And then during that same period of time, we got word that Eidos was going to take Tomb Raider away from Core and give it to Crystal. And so that changed the landscape for me. Like, okay, that complicates my decision. So it's like, well, look, if I could stay, I'd been directing for 10 years at Crystal. If I could stay and be the director on that, then probably I wouldn't go to Naughty Dog, right? Yeah. But I kind of got the message that I think they were so worried about, even though I'd been doing the job for 10 years, they were so worried about kind of how the Tomb Raider franchise had slipped that they needed a sure bet. If they were going to move it to another studio, they wanted to make sure they had some world-class, you know, creative director to come in and ensure that the game would get back on its feet. And so that wasn't going to be me. And so I was like, well, okay, that made my decision for me. I'm going to go to Naughty Dog, right? Yeah. It wasn't acrimonious. It was just, you know. And they hired, oh, God, I'm going to forget now. Never mind. My brain is so tired. You have no idea. It's amazing I'm rubbing any little brain cells together at all at this point. So what was interesting was, of course, I went in my first year at Naughty Dog was being game director for Jak 3. Yeah. But knowing that we were going to, for the PlayStation 3, create a new franchise. And that was part of the enticement of actually joining Naughty Dog at this point. And so we talked about a lot of things, and we sort of circled around slowly to this idea of doing something in this space, because, I mean, I love pulp adventure, right? Yeah. Which is why I would have loved to try to tackle Lara Croft. I think I would have done the same thing. Look, we don't really have aspirational heroes, kind of two-dimensional aspirational heroes in the way we used to. Yeah. James Bond was completely re-envisioned with Daniel Craig to be a flawed, vulnerable character, right? That's what we want these days, versus the old James Bond, which was clearly sort of a cardboard cutout. Yeah. I mean, deliberately so, and this aspirational figure. That's what Lara Croft was, right? She was a sort of perfect, you know, character that didn't have any flaws, was brilliant and snarky, and because that was the model. And so when we defined what we wanted Uncharted to be, well, for me, of course, you look at Harrison Ford and Indiana Jones, and the guy's always dirty and sweaty, and looks like his hands hurt, and he's always on his heels, And it's like that's far more relatable, and far more contemporary now, right? To have these characters that are not completely, on top of things. They're always, the way we said, is always at the edge of his ability, right? So that gave us a distinguishing feature to go, okay, aspirational, fine, we'll be relatable. Yeah. Female, all right, we'll be male, and so the personality, the tone of the game, everything was partly defined by being different than. Yeah. So it was very interesting to see how they kind of arrived at the same conclusion as they rebooted Tomb Raider, that it's the Daniel Craig thing, right? Like you have to rethink these heroes if you're going to keep them feeling contemporary and relevant. Yeah. Right.
Well, I think, obviously not to say that they copied you or that they in any way took from you, but...
Well, we always, everybody in the industry copies each other. That's how we move the medium forward, right?
But did you feel like you were doing that with Uncharted? Because it's so easy to look back at it now and say, it's so iconic. You know, it's this game that did change the way that we relate to our protagonist. It was a whole new tone. And did it feel like you were doing that at the time, or were you just writing?
No, I think it was intentional, but probably not to the degree that ended up happening, right?
Yeah.
I mean, because how could you foresee that? We definitely wanted to do things in a completely new way. It was the first title. I mean, Naughty Dog obviously had been doing traditional animation in their games, more cartoony style. And we wanted, with the PlayStation 3, to figure out how we could actually make a really believable human character and characters, right? And so some of what you decide to do, from, both in terms of design and technically, comes from kind of enumerating what those goals are and that, you know, what are the therefores that come out of that. Meaning, if you want this guy to feel like he is a human actor that you cast, and that he is as vulnerable and relatable as, you know, Harrison Ford is and Indiana Jones is, then, okay, he can't just move like a robotic video game character. We're going to need a complex, layered, blended animation system. We've talked about this a lot, that it's like, to feel organic, you have to make sure that the character can do everything at any time that feels appropriate, meaning he might have to stumble and draw his gun and throw himself into cover, you know, and then load his gun. And those things all have to be layers of animation, almost like Photoshop layers, right?
Yeah.
That then influence, you know, the base rig, the base skeleton. So that was something that didn't exist. We had to create, because the goal was, well, how do we make this guy that feels loose and organic, right? Yeah. Why is he in a t-shirt and jeans? And we actually got some heat from that, both from some people in the media, some fans internally, Sony, like marketing, that they, you know, the feeling was, what is this? Why do I care about a guy in t-shirt and jeans?
Yeah.
And it's like, and inside I'm thinking, well, if it was Tom Cruise, you wouldn't ask that question, right? Yeah. So the point is if our goal, if the moonshot was to say, we're going to create a character that is iconic as if it was an actor, the star of our movies, then we have to treat him the same way we would that actor, even though he's a completely made-up character, right?
Yeah, yeah.
That means he has to have a t-shirt that wrinkles, and, you know, and just in jeans that get wet, and like, and hair, you know. Well, it was the bald Space Marine era, right? You know, and so that then defined, you know, our technical and aesthetic and then design goals, right? But did we foresee absolutely that it would like become this landmark that people would then copy? No, of course not. You don't see that. But I think we were aware that we were intentionally going after new, bold ways of doing things that felt like they were breaking the mold, and just digging our heels in and defending the decision, right? You know, I felt like I spent a lot of that first, you know, development of Uncharted 1 going, you're just gonna have to trust me, you know, like, and because, you know, Sony marketing, I remember them saying, we don't know what to do with this character. This isn't a mascot. We need characters like Kratos, right? Yeah. And I'm like, well, I don't know what that means. And I had game reviewers saying, like, you know, who is this guy in a t-shirt and jeans? And I'm like, and I was laughing to the team going, well, what do they want? Like, you know, a top hat and a monocle? I mean, we don't make caricatures. This is a character. This is the protagonist of our story. And that same reviewer, once he saw the game and played it, did a callback to his own sort of like cynical comment and said, after I finish the game, I think he's the next Indiana Jones. Yeah. So it's like, okay, we knew at that point that we did the right thing. The fact that it would be such a milestone that would influence people, you don't know that until hindsight.
I mean, it's safe to say he did, because I think we all saw Poe in the new Star Wars trailer.
Yeah, I know. It's so funny, right? Now, granted, J.J. Abrams is a huge Uncharted fan, and obviously it's mutual. That's also a very iconic just look, you know, for action-adventure heroes. So you could bring up...
Take it.
Oh, no. Look, this happens all the time, and it's incredibly flattering, because it's like there's so many filmmakers, you know, certainly if J.J. and I are about the same age, but like, especially younger guys that came up as gamers that are constantly homaging the games they love in their films, right? And so I think after the Black Mirror episode that Dan Trachtenberg directed, he like reached out and he's like, did you notice the protagonist's shirt? It was Nate's, you know, baseball shirt with the sleeves. Yeah. And Jordan Vogt Roberts obviously is hugely influenced by Uncharted. The guys making Mission Impossible, Chris McQuarrie, I mean, they completely like said, you know, that like that plane scene was completely inspired by Uncharted. So there's definitely this sort of like dialogue going on between. So we steal stuff from them, you know. One of the inspirations for Uncharted 2, starting in medias res like that, was seeing Mission Impossible 3, J.J. Abrams again.
Yeah.
And, you know, and the idea that you start just right in the action going, like, what the hell is going on? And then you back up from the flash forward, and now you spend the whole first half of the film going, we know we're going to end up there at some point, but what on earth and how are we getting there, right? That's fun. So, you know, all of these things are mutual homages and sort of love letters to each other. So that's been fun. Yeah, who knows, you know, whether that's just drawing on tropes because we're all drawing on the same tropes, or JJ's definitely winking at Uncharted 3. I have no idea. We will have to ask him.
Well, I'd like to.
He's a little busy right now.
A little busy.
A little busy.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was absolutely fantastic having you here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. This is my last slot in the Kickstarter studio. I could not have gone out with a better guest.
Congratulations. That's quite an achievement.
Thank you very much. And thank you guys at home.